Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, asking the question, are official U.S. temperature graphs credible? I'm going to make a separate video about global temperature graphs, but as I'm about to show you, U.S. temperature graphs are extremely important. This map shows stations in the NOAA Global Historical Climatology Network, which had daily temperature data from 1891 to 1920. NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. As you can see, the vast majority of the high-quality data in the world is located in the United States, and much of the world has little or no daily temperature data available. So for understanding long-term temperature trends, the United States is critically important. Let's start by going back 90 years to this article in the New York Times dated July 2nd, 1931. The New York Times wrote this: that there is some relation between sunspots and our weather has long been suspected by meteorologists. Now they are certain. So in 1931 there was a unanimous consensus among meteorologists that solar activity controlled the climate. But now NASA reports a very different story. They say, multiple studies published in peer-reviewed scientific journals show that 97% or more of actively publishing climate scientists agree. Climate warming trends over the past century are extremely likely due to human activities. Given that humans don't control solar activity, this would be a pretty radical change in position. So let's look at the trends in U.S. temperature. This was the official published NASA U.S. temperature graph in 1999. It showed that the 1930s was the warmest decade, 1934 was the hottest year, and there was a significant cooling trend from the 1930s through the end of the 20th century. Now let's look at the current version of the NASA U.S. temperature graph. As you can see, NASA has massively cooled temperatures from the 1930s, warmed recent temperatures, and turned a long-term cooling trend into a warming trend. Let's flash back and forth a few times between the two graphs so you can see how NASA has altered their own data. This is the current graph. This was from 20 years ago. Current, 20 years ago. Cooling trend. Now they have a warming trend. People assume that the graphs they see from NASA showing warming are accurate, but as I'm about to show you, that simply isn't true. NASA's James Hansen largely started the global warming scare during the 1980s. He was also the person in charge of NASA temperature graphs, so he had a pretty serious conflict of interest. He wanted the graphs to reflect his forecasts. 35 years ago, he said, the average U.S. temperature has risen from 1 to 2 degrees since 1958 and is predicted to increase an additional 3 or 4 degrees sometime between 2010 and 2020. He said that with an expected doubling of atmospheric carbon dioxide by 2040, the number of days each year with temperatures over 90 degrees would rise from 35 to 85 in Washington, D.C. and Omaha, Nebraska. You might notice that the article has a typo. It says 80 degrees, but Hansen actually said 90 degrees. That is 32 degrees Celsius. Let's see how his forecast did. He predicted 4 to 6 degrees warming in the United States from 1958 to 2020, but there's actually only been about 1 degree. And why did he start his forecast in 1958? His own temperature graph showed that the 1930s were much hotter. He was being very deceptive by cherry-picking 1958 as his start point. Now let's look at his forecast that the number of 90-degree days at Omaha and Washington, D.C. would more than double. The closest currently active United States Historical Climatology Network station to Omaha, Nebraska is located at Logan, Iowa. Since the 19th century, there's been a sharp decline in the number of 90-degree days, with recent decades being at a record low. Peak years were 1894 and 1936. In 1894 and 1936, Logan, Iowa had 83 days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but in recent years they've been averaging less than 30. Hansen got that forecast exactly backwards. Now let's look at the Washington, D.C. area. The closest United States Historical Climatology Network station in Virginia to Washington, D.C. is located at Purcellville. Just like at Omaha, there's been a sharp decline in the number of 90-degree days at Purcellville since the end of the 19th century, with the peak year occurring in 1911. During 1911, Purcellville had 96 days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. 1911 was an extremely hot year in the United States and Europe. We had the hottest July 4th on record in the United States in 1911. New England set their all-time record maximum temperatures. Thousands of people in New England died from the heat, and tens of thousands of people in France and Germany did as well. Just like at Omaha, the number of 90-degree days at Purcellville has plummeted to record lows in recent decades. Once again, Hansen got his forecasts exactly backwards. And if we look at the data for the entire United States, we see the same trend. The number of 90-degree days has plummeted. Prior to 60 years ago, the United States had a lot more 90-degree days than we do now. And it also becomes pretty clear why Hansen cherry-picked the year 1958 to start his prediction. It's because the United States was much hotter prior to 1958. NASA's Dr. James Hansen was intentionally misleading the public, and the story gets much worse as I'm about to show you. In 1988, he also predicted that there was going to be a huge increase in the number of droughts in the United States. Dr. James E. Hansen, director of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, who presented recent data compiled from computer models, said that predicted regional effects of global warming show that the chances of summer drought in the low to mid latitudes would be 1 in 3 by the year 2030 as against 1 in 20 in the 1950s. When he was talking about the mid latitudes, this of course included the United States. Let's see how his forecast did. This is the NOAA U.S. Palmer drought severity graph going back to the 19th century. Brown means drought and green means wet. As you can see, the United States has been getting wetter since the 19th century, and the worst droughts in the United States occurred during the 1930s and the 1950s. Hansen said that the chances of drought during the 1950s were 1 in 20, but he was off by a factor of 10. The 1950s were actually in drought about half the time. This was 1988 when Hansen made his forecast. The United States was having a very bad drought at the time, but right after that the United States got very wet. Hansen was wrong both about the past and about the future. He has no clue what he's talking about. So in 1989, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration refuted him in this front-page article in the New York Times. January 26, 1989, U.S. data since 1895 failed to show warming trend. After examining climate data extending back nearly 100 years, a team of government scientists has concluded there has been no significant change in average temperatures or rainfall in the United States over that entire period. Reality was bad news for Dr. Hansen, but he had very powerful political friends, so reality was really no object in moving his story forwards. In 1989, NOAA said that there was no warming in the United States from 1895 to 1987, but their current graph shows a lot of warming during that period. NOAA has also altered their data. Both government agencies, NASA and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, have tampered with their own data to create an imaginary warming trend. Let's take a closer look now at how that happened. This is a 1999 NASA paper from Dr. Hansen. He was very concerned that his forecasts of increasing heat and increasing drought had failed. But since he was not only in charge of the forecasts but also in charge of the data, this was not a problem. He was able to simply alter the data. NASA and NOAA started working together to alter the trends. They started making adjustments to the U.S. temperature data. This is the 2004 version of their adjustments. They made very few adjustments prior to the year 1958, but from 1958 to about 1990 there was a hockey stick of increasing temperatures they created by altering the data. NASA and NOAA created about half a degree warming from 1958 to 1990 by changing the data. At these agencies, if the data doesn't match the theory, they change the data instead of changing the theory. But note that they stopped making further alterations to the data after 1990. From 1990 through 1999, the adjustments were flat. Now let's look at the current adjustments, which I calculated this week. The adjustments now are huge, about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the beginning of the 20th century. Not surprisingly, NOAA no longer publishes their adjustment graphs because the public would be horrified if they did, so I have to make the calculations myself. What they do now is knock about 1 degree Fahrenheit off measured temperatures prior to 1960 and add about 1 degree Fahrenheit onto most recent temperatures. So NOAA has created a 2-degree hockey stick of warming simply by altering the data, and NASA uses this same scheme. Reported U.S. warming is not due to climate, it's due to data tampering by government scientists. And that tampering has gotten much worse over the past 15 years. The blue line shows the 2004 version of NOAA temperature adjustments, and the red line shows the current version. In 2004, the adjustments were about 1/4 of what they currently are, and they flattened off after the year 1990. But now the adjustments are much larger, and they accelerate after the year 1990. Based on the documentation which NOAA has published, these adjustments should have remained flat after 1990. This hockey stick shouldn't exist. These adjustments aren't based on science, they're based on political need. But this graph is the real smoking gun. Along the y-axis is plotted the adjustment, and along the x-axis is plotted atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. You can see that until 3 years ago there was almost a perfect correlation between NOAA adjustments and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They're adjusting the data to match their theory, the exact opposite of how science is supposed to be done. But over the last 3 years they're not even bothering to do that. Now they're just adding huge adjustments on which don't seem to have any basis at all. Next, I'm going to show you just how awful these adjustments are. These are some temperatures from the NOAA Adjusted Temperature Data Set for Brewton, Alabama. This is the station ID, this is the year, and these columns are the temperatures for each month. 1284 means that the temperature was 12.84 degrees Celsius, and the E means that it was estimated, which means it came from a computer model rather than from a thermometer. As you can see, all of the last 6 years of temperature data from Brewton, Alabama came from a computer model rather than from a thermometer. There are 1,218 stations in the NOAA United States Historical Climatology Network database, and this graph shows the percent of data which is fabricated or came from a computer model rather than from a thermometer. Prior to 1980, about 10% of the data was fabricated, but last year it was nearly 50%. You can see that over the past 30 years there's been a hockey stick of fabricated data. When you're making up temperatures in a computer model, you can pretty much get any result you want. Now let's look at how bad the NOAA data tampering is. This graph shows the monthly maximum temperature data for the NOAA United States Historical Climatology Network. You can see that there's been a strong cooling trend over the past century, with the warmest year being 1934 and the coolest year being 2019. But after NOAA tampers with the data, they create a strong warming trend during the same period. The incredibly hot 1930s are no longer very warm, and now 2012 is the warmest year. Let's flip back and forth a few times between the adjusted warming trend and the actual measured cooling trend. Warming, cooling. The warming is created by tampering with the temperature data. The 1930s were extremely hot, but government agencies have erased the heat of the 1930s. Thousands and thousands of Americans died of the heat during the 1930s, and millions of people had to flee the Great Plains and move to California in order to save themselves from dying from heat and thirst. Dr. Hansen wrote about this in his 1989 paper. He said, empirical evidence does not lend much support to the notion that climate is headed precipitately toward more extreme heat and drought. The drought of 1999 covered a smaller area than the 1988 drought when the Mississippi River almost dried up, and 1988 was a temporary inconvenience as compared with repeated droughts during the 1930s Dust Bowl that caused an exodus from the prairies, as chronicled in Steinbeck's novel The Grapes of Wrath. The U.S. has warmed during the past century, but the warming hardly exceeds year-to-year variability. Indeed, in the U.S., the warmest decade was the 1930s, and the warmest year was 1934. This is what the measured temperature data shows. The 1930s was the warmest decade, and 1934 was the warmest year. But NOAA and NASA have erased the heat of the 1930s and erased the heat of 1934. These graphs and this map are from the current official U.S. government National Climate Assessment. They show that the 1930s were much hotter than recent decades. So it's extremely brazen of NOAA and NASA to erase the heat of the 1930s, which is shown very clearly in other government documents. And NASA and NOAA altering government data is not going to bring the thousands of people who died in the 1930s heat back to life. We have a very unfortunate situation in the US government where we have climate modelers also managing the temperature data. They're acting as judge and jury of their own forecasts. The current situation is like a sporting event where the same people comprise both teams, and they're also acting as referee, coach, scorekeeper, and cheerleaders. The public wouldn't put up with this in sports, which are easy to understand. But the press and politicians have worked very hard to make the public feel intimidated by people whom they call scientists or experts. The public is told that they're not smart enough or entitled to question these fraudsters who are installed at government agencies. Government climate science is a complete farce. It has nothing to do with reality. People frequently say to me, "How dare you question the work of NASA? They took us to the moon." But the reality is that many of the people with the right stuff who took us to the moon are also climate skeptics. A few years ago, 49 of the top people from the Apollo program wrote a letter to the NASA administrator blasting the agency for making unwarranted claims about the role of carbon dioxide in global warming. The people currently doing climate junk science at NASA are not the people who took us to the moon, and many of the people who did go to the moon are embarrassed by the current state of NASA climate junk science, including Harrison Schmitt, the only scientist to have ever walked on the moon. George Orwell in his novel 1984 said, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Government agencies are rewriting temperature history in order to push a political agenda for the future. Politicians want to demonize carbon dioxide in order to seize control of U.S. energy production. So NASA and NOAA are creating fake temperature graphs showing warming which doesn't exist. And then after they create the fake temperature graphs, they blame the warming on carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide comes from burning fossil fuels. What the politicians are trying to do is make the public afraid of the very fuels which keep them alive and comfortable. These people are playing an extremely dangerous game which threatens the lives of billions of people around the world. In this video I showed you that US temperature graphs are not credible, and in another video I'll show you the same thing for global temperature graphs. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this climate fraud for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.